Hi and welcome back to part 3 of this texturing tutorial. As you can see, I have added quite a few height details and cleaned up some of the lines and borders since the previous part. The biggest changes are probably here at the front. I raised the bottom bumper part a bit and also lowered the metal part here at the top, as I thought it gave it a better look together with this air outtake detail I added on the side. Added some details to the rims. I also changed up the design quite a bit on the back. And added quite a bit of smaller details to various parts of the model. But no new techniques were used, so use more of the same that we went over in the previous part. So since I'm finished with alpha stamping, the next thing I want to do is create new curvature and AO maps, where these height details are included, so that the details are taken into account when using smart masks or smart materials, or other generators that makes use of AO and curvature information. For this, I want to use the traditional route without anchor points. My reason being that I want to keep this quite beginner friendly, and me trying to explain anchor points would be a whole tutorial by itself. My second reason is that I normally don't use anchor points for this purpose, as it complicates things more than it speeds things up. I find it very useful for other things though. So to start, we want to create a normal map which has all the details included. To create a new normal map with the height details included, I simply need to export out the normal map. So I will go to File in the top menu, then Export Textures. There are many different export setting templates to choose from, and you can also create your own. Usually for a standard export, I use the Document Channels template. In my case, I have already set up most settings beforehand, but go ahead and choose where you want to export the files to. In my case, I'll export it as a 16-bit TIFF file. For resolution, I'll just choose the largest size available, and then we can export. Ideally, I would create an export template that only exports the normal map, as that is the only map I need right now. It would save some time. Once the textures have been exported, locate the normal map file. Drag the normal map file to your Substance Painter shelf and add it as a texture file. Now you can drag the new normal map into your normal map slot. This will temporarily make the details look very intense, as they are now both in height and normals. But once curvature and ambient occlusion is baked, I can turn off the normal map. In the past, I would use a software like Substance Designer to convert my height map details into ambient occlusion and curvature, and then blend it with my original maps in Photoshop. But since trying out newer versions of Substance Painter, I feel that it does quite a good job at baking it directly in the baker. So I opted to sticking to it, as I would prefer to stay in the same software if possible. This basically means that the high poly ambient occlusion and curvature bakes I did in part 1 won't be used. But there is always situations where spending more time to get those 10% of extra quality is worth it. So let's treat that as a bonus tutorial. Let's start baking the maps. First, let's bake the non-AO and curvature maps. The world space normals are especially important, as it seems like that's where the AO and curvature takes its information from, and not the normal map that we added ourselves. So to bake the AO and curvature, we first need to bake the world space normals. I don't think this is how it worked in the past. I might be wrong, But if you're wondering why your new normal details are not showing up in your AO and curvature bakes, this might be the reason. Now that the world space normals are baked, we can go ahead and bake the AO and curvature maps as well. I'll just use the same settings that we used when baking in part 1. The AO and curvature bake is now done, and the added details should now influence your results when using smart materials and generators. Before I start working on the existing materials, I want to add some more color to the model. I think the doors on the top might work well with some color, so I'll create a new groove for it and start to mask it out with a contrasty color. I will speed parts like this up quite a lot, since it wouldn't be much fun or use to sift through. If you feel you have missed something in regards to settings or folder structure, you can always open up the full Substance Painter project and take a closer look, as it's available in the downloadable content. As you can see, I often use the 2D/3D split screen for manual painting, especially for details like these that don't have actual geometry. Depending on the angle, it's easy to get tricked by the lighting in the 3D view. Now that the mask is finished, I can experiment with some colors. I think a reddish color might fit quite well with this color theme. I think I might actually change the hydraulics color to match the door color, as I feel it might work better than yellow. I'll go back and unmask the handle on the door. Let's start working on the materials. The first thing I want to do is create a base metal material that will be the bottom layer for all parts of the model. For some parts it will be the main material, and for some parts it will be partly visible through cracks and other damage. I do have a lot of already made smart materials that would work great for this purpose, but there wouldn't be much to learn from that, so I'll do as much as I can from scratch. I'll uncheck all other layers to make it easier to work on. I'm gonna start by creating a base of dents and scratches as height details. I almost always add the mask to a folder instead of adding them directly to the fill layer, as it allows me to go back and add more folders and masks, and freely change the order I want them to be in. I'll add a smart mask called Dirt Heavy to my empty mask. I usually use this smart mask as a base when I want to use grunge and tile maps that will cover an entire surface without being AO or edge dependent. You will see me use this smart mask quite a lot. You could set this up from scratch without using the smart mask, but this is quicker and there is no need to reinvent what is already there. All tiles and grunge maps that I use in this tutorial are Substance Painter originals, so you should be able to find all the maps that I use in your own copy of Substance Painter. I want these height details to be quite subtle, so I will give it a low height intensity. When I start working with parameters and sliders, there's a lot of back and forth, and I'm mostly experimenting, which tends to drag out, so I will speed the video up quite a bit during these parts. And as said before, if you want to take a closer look at any specific settings in detail, you can download the Substance Painter project file. As I find the result I'm happy with, I'll duplicate the current dense layer group to make another variation. This time I want to use a smart mask that uses curvature to add some dents and damage to the edges as well. So I'll choose a smart mask called Stains Scratches. It will also give some variation to the surface with some larger scratches and dents. I think I have a good height base now, and as I'll just be rotating around the viewport, let's skip to the next step. The next thing I want to add is some edge highlight. Normally, you will probably only use roughness for your edge highlights, especially if you're going for realism. But I'm not thinking too much about realism for this project. If anything, I want it to look a bit stylized. So I also use color to make it pop a bit extra. I'll start with a base edge highlight that is smooth and even across the whole model. So I need a smart mask that masks all edges evenly. For this, I'll use the Edges Strong Smart Mask. This smart mask gives you the option to use textures with your edge mask to break it up, but you can also choose settings which gives you a clean edge mask. I often add level nodes to my masks to add contrast, instead of using the contrast sliders that are often included with the smart masks, as it gives you more freedom. I'm calling it a level node, although it's not really a node. Just not sure what I would call it in Substance Painter. I'm adding another edge highlight layer group, this time with the Fabric Edge Damage Smart Mask. I'll use this one to add some irregularities and scratches to the edge highlight. I could just add it to my previous edge highlight layer group, but I prefer to split it up into different layer groups, so I can use different color and roughness values. As usual, I do a lot of back and forth between the smart mask settings and the levels node to get the result that I want. I think I have a good base now. The edge highlight is definitely a bit too intense, but that is on purpose to make it more visible to myself while working on it. I will tone it down as I get closer to finishing the texture. Next, I'll be adding some ambient occlusion based dust and dirt. For this, I'll use the Dirt Cavities Smart Mask. The AO is a lot more intense at the lower parts of the model, so if I want to get well-balanced dirt on the lower parts, it won't be noticeable on the top parts. So I will focus on the lower parts for this layer group, then later create a new layer group that focuses on the upper parts. I got some weird artifacts from the smart mask, so I create a paint node to the mask and manually exclude those areas from the mask. Now let's create the second layer group for the upper parts. I'll add an extra folder in mask that I will use to mask and isolate the upper parts, as I only want this dirt layer to affect those specific parts. I'll use the polygon fill tool with the mesh fill option to quickly mask out those parts. You can press Alt plus left mouse button on the mask to see the mask directly on the model, which makes it easier to see what you're masking. I'll add the same Dirt Cavities Smart Mask for this layer group as well. As the top parts don't have much ambient occlusion information, I'm treating this more as a general dirt layer that covers the whole surface. It might look weird when looking at it like this, but most of this won't be visible, as there will be other materials on top of the metal material. I'm creating a second dirt layer group for the top parts. For this one, I'll use the dust occlusion smart mask. With this layer group, I'll try to give the alpha details some stronger ambient occlusion dirt, as well as add a darker gradient along the edges using the curvature. But I still want the edge highlights to show, so I put the new dirt layer group beneath the edge highlights groups. I'll add a blur and levels node to the mask to help create a good looking gradient along the edges. As you can see, this really makes the edge highlight look super intense, so I'll lower the color opacity for both the edge highlight layer groups to balance it out. I want some parts less intense than others for the top dirt, so I'll create a new folder plus mask inside the dirt layer group and add a levels node to it and use it to make the mask 50% gray. Now I'll add a paint node to the same mask and use a brush to return some of the edges to fully white. I used one of the grunge brushes to add some extra texture to the edge gradient. This is the last I'll do on the base metal material for now. Later, I'll be rebaking ambient occlusion and curvature to include the dents and scratches, so the look of the material will change quite a bit. So I try not to spend too much time on details now, and come back to it later when all the height details are baked into ambient occlusion and curvature, and I can balance it to the rest of the texture. I'm adding color markers to the main materials, just to make the layers stack a bit easier to read before it gets too complicated and cluttered. I'll now switch to the body main material. For this material, I want it to be something similar to the type of surface you see on a tank. Might not take it that far, but I'll use that as a starting point and see what turns out best. First, I want to add some color or hue variation. So I'll create a new layer group inside the body main group. I'll add the dirt heavy smart mask to the new layer group. Adding a noise map to it. I'll use the levels node to give it more contrast. Adding a blur slope filter. This filter can be very useful when you're making a camouflage type of texture, but also works great for adding variation to the texture, especially if you combine it with other masks. I'll go back and forth between the different nodes and filters to find a good balance. Eventually, I want it to be more of a subtle color shift, so I'll come back to it later on as well. Next thing I want to do is create some height dents specific to this material. I use the dirt heavy smart mask and basically do the same thing I did for the base metal dents, but a bit bigger in scale. I'll create a second dense layer group with some even bigger scale dents and scratches to get more variation. Next, I'll create a dirt layer using the dirt cavity smart mask. The look of the dirt layer will probably change a lot after baking down the dents and scratches, so won't spend too much time on it now and save it for later. I want to create a darker color gradient at the front. Not sure if I want to add it on all parts or just the body main material, but I'll start by adding it to the body main material. I'll create a new layer group and add a generator node to the mask. And I'll choose to use the 3D linear gradient generator. With this generator, I can use the position map to pick a start and end point for the gradient. I'll switch viewport view so I can see the position map directly on my model. Then I can use the color picker tool on my model to pick where my gradient should start and end. I'll add a levels node to adjust the strength and contrast of the gradient. I will get back to the gradient again later, when I have a better idea of what I want to do. I want to add some bigger sized directional scratches at the front of the model, which should affect all materials and parts of the model. So I put the new layer group at the top of the layer stack. Adding the dirt heavy smart mask to the mask. And I'll pick the map called directional scratches. This map doesn't offer much customization, so the main thing I do is change the tiling scale. Then I use the levels node together with the balance slider to get a nice amount and variation of scratches. As you can probably see, the scratches are currently projected based on the direction of their UVs, making the scratches go in different directions. To fix this, I just go and change the projection settings to triplanar projection. Now I can choose the direction manually. Although I like the scratches, there are currently too many of them, and they don't really fit on all parts of the model. So I will add a mask to the top folder and use the polygon fill tool to choose the parts which I want to add scratches to. Now I'll add a paint node to the same mask and use it to delete some of the scratches to balance and break up the tiling a bit. Next, let's go to the front bumper material. I want to add some kind of height noise to it, something similar to anti-slipping surfaces or sandpaper. I don't have any reference for it, but I recall bumpers having a rougher, bumpy surface. Either way, as long as it looks good, it's okay with me. So I'll add a dirt heavy smart mask and add a noise map to it. Up until now, I have mostly worked with in-pushing height values, but for this, I want the bumpy surface to push outwards. I'll also add a dirt layer with the dirt cavities smart mask. I won't touch it too much, as it will change a lot later on because of the height noise. Next, I'll work on the tire material. I'll start by adding some soft dents and imperfections with the dirt heavy smart mask. It's the same setup that I used for the base metal material, but with softer dents to make it look more like rubber. I'm trying to finish all materials that uses height information first, so I can go ahead and bake it down before I continue with the rest. I'll also add the same type of directional scratches that I used for the body. I'm basically setting it up the same way as I did for the body, so no need to go over it again. I want the edges of the tire marks to look a bit worn compared to the flatter parts. For this, I'll use a smart mask called Dust Soft Edges. Once I bake down the height, the scratches on the tire should also get this soft edge. Switching over to the top material. Looking at the color now, it feels too brown and bright. I want it to be a bit darker and desaturated, so I'll change that a bit. This material is just supposed to be a thin paint layer, so the base metal material should come through around edges, scratches and other damage. I will use the Edge's strong smart mask to use curvature to break up the material around the edges. But as this material will also change a lot later on because of the height details, it's better to not spend too much time on it now. I think I have a good base now, and all currently planned height details are now added. So let's start with the baking process. Same as last time. If I do add something later, I can always redo the baking process once more. The bake is now finished, and you can see that some of the detail has gotten edge damage, as well as the dirt layers are looking different. But since I set up the smart masks without the details baked, I now need to readjust the settings to fully make use of the new maps. So I'll go ahead and do some adjustments. I have now readjusted the smart masks quite a bit. I will continue to adjust them as I go, but it should be fine for now. Before I end this part, I want to add one last thing to the bumper material. As the noise bumps are sticking out, it feels like they should have lost some color due to collisions and other wear and tear. I'll use the Edge's strong smart mask, as I want to catch the bumps with the curvature. I think that's looking quite good. I'm gonna continue doing readjustments to the body material, but I think that's it for this part, and I will continue where I left off in the next part. I hope to see you there.